So DNA tests are heavily restricted in Israel, which has led to some viral claims online.
Israel is a lie.
I wonder why Israel doesn't want their people taking DNA tests.
Because it proves through your DNA that Jews around the world have no ancestral ties to the land of Israel.
Because then they would figure out that they are white.
Now look, it's easy to just write this stuff off, but Israel really does have some serious restriction on DNA testing. And once you start pulling that thread, things get stranger than you'd expect. Like if an Israeli man wants to get a DNA test on his own child to see if he's really the father, Israeli courts often try to bury the truth. This whole thing is especially ironic given the fact that Israel has always been on the forefront of DNA science and home to one of the biggest consumer DNA testing companies in the world. So why does Israel really restrict DNA testing? This post on X racked up 2.5 million views. Now, DNA tests aren't actually illegal in Israel, but they are heavily restricted, which is confusing. So to help me figure this all out, I reached out to an Israeli lawyer named Joshua Pex, who explained that certain types of DNA tests are actually quite common in Israel.
So in Israel, DNA testing that are allowed are those that get the permission of the court, or they're done for medical purposes, or for scientific research.
So for example, it's very easy for a couple to get DNA screenings before having a baby to check on the risk for genetic diseases. DNA tests are also common for immigration purposes.
Part of the process of proving Israeli citizenship sometimes requires a paternity test, a DNA test between a child and an Israeli father. Once the DNA connection is established, then we can register the child as an Israeli citizen.
The rules for DNA tests are all laid out in Israel's genetic information law. And while DNA tests are common for medical, scientific, and court-approved legal reasons, there's another kind of test that's completely forbidden. So no spitting in a tube, mailing it out, and discovering that you have 15% Neanderthal DNA. Which raises the question, why would Israel stop its people from learning about its DNA ancestry? To get the answer, I asked Joshua to explain why Israel's genetic information law was originally passed.
The concerns are actually that this information will be transferred to insurance companies or to employers, and this information will be used to discriminate.
So basically, the original law was trying to protect people's privacy. This was back in the year 2000, when DNA testing was a new technology, and people were very concerned how companies might collect and use this very personal information. And at the time, there was no mass market home DNA tests. It would be another 6 years before 23andMe would even be founded.
The genetic information law in Israel had nothing to do at all with finding the true origins of people or their heritage or ancestors. It had everything to do with protecting privacy of the information.
And Israel's not alone. Other countries also prohibit home DNA tests, like France and Germany. And no one's claiming that the French are trying to hide their true ancestry.
I'm French! Why do you think I have this outrageous accent, you silly thing?
But privacy concerns alone don't explain the strangest DNA cases in Israel. Imagine you've got a strong feeling that your wife is hiding a giant secret, that you're not really the father of her child. So you go to court for a DNA paternity test, and instead of helping you learn the truth, the judge seems to be doing everything possible to stop you. It sounds completely counterintuitive and extremely frustrating, but it happens in Israel.
The husband will come to the court and say, I suspect that this child is not mine. But the courts will not want to do the DNA test.
But why would Israeli courts possibly want to bury the truth? It ties back to an ancient Jewish law about something called a mamzer, which is someone who is born as a result of a forbidden relationship, like incest or adultery. If you're a mamzer, Judaism prohibits you from marrying anyone except other mamzers and converts to Judaism. And this doesn't just apply to the mamzer, but to all the mamzer's descendants, even after 10 generations. Think about what that means for a child who had no say how they were conceived. They didn't do anything wrong, yet that label follows them for the rest of their life. And their children, and their children's children. But how did such a harsh rule survive for thousands of years without absolutely destroying communities? The answer is it probably rarely came up, because during ancient times, it would have been much harder to prove that the child was actually born out of adultery. In most cases, you simply wouldn't know for certain. But these days, DNA paternity tests make it much easier to prove. What we have now is a collision between ancient law and modern science that creates enormous religious consequences for an innocent child. According to Joshua, that's why courts bend over backwards to avoid DNA tests that might reveal any inconvenient truths.
So the courts are very hesitant to send children and fathers to do the DNA tests because they actually don't want the results to show that the husband isn't the father and label the children as mamzer.
It may seem weird for an Israeli court to look the other way and try to avoid the truth, but when you think about it, it's kind of a compassionate way to protect children from a draconian religious law. The irony, though, is that people accuse Israel of trying to hide the fact that Jews have no ancestral ties, when the strangest cases in Israeli court exist precisely for the opposite reason. A deep connection to rules followed thousands of years ago in the same land. So you can say Israel isn't running from its past. It's kind of still governed by it. Now to be clear, the idea of mamzer exists in Jewish law, not Israeli law. It's not like the state of Israel can control who a mamzer can and can't marry. But the thing is, Israel doesn't have civil marriage. There's no equivalent of going down to the courthouse or eloping in Vegas. You could only get married by a religious authority, and that includes Jewish, Muslim, Christian, or Druze. So if you're Jewish and found to be a mamzer, the Jewish authority won't perform the wedding simply because it violates Jewish law. Israel, however, does recognize civil marriages if performed abroad.
If you're a very secular person, then maybe it doesn't affect you so much because there's no civil marriage. You won't be able to marry in Israel. You'll need to fly out to Cyprus, but then you can marry whoever you want.
Well, that's all well and good, but where does that leave the guy who's pretty sure his wife cheated on him? Well, the truth is, it's not really that hard to get an at-home DNA test in Israel either. 23andMe even ships directly to Israel according to their website. But here's another strange twist. One of their major competitors, MyHeritage, doesn't ship their kits to Israel, but the company was founded there.
MyHeritage is one of the biggest companies in the world for this DNA testing. They're an international company and they can sell to consumers all over the world, but not in Israel.
So an Israeli DNA company helped popularize consumer DNA tests while being barred from selling its product to its own people. But Joshua says it's not hard for Israelis to get around the rules.
Practically speaking, you can just give an address outside of Israel and fill out the information and get it sent to a different address and then have it shipped to you, So it's not like there's the police going around and checking.
The point is, Israel's genetic information law was not designed to prevent people from learning about their ancestry. If it were, it'd be failing miserably, because Jewish DNA is already out there for the world to see. Which completely blows up the conspiracy theorists' claim, because you know what that DNA actually shows? That Jews all around the world absolutely do have ancestral ties to the land of Israel. Just one example, in 2020, researchers analyzed the DNA of ancient Canaanites from burial sites in what's now Israel and Jordan. What they found was many modern Jewish groups likely derive more than half their ancestry from the ancient Near East. And other studies have consistently shown that Jews from all over the world share significant genetic markers tracing back to ancient Israel. So in the end, it's the conspiracy theorists who want to bury the Jewish story told by DNA, not Israel.